Alright, fantasy fanatics and medieval dreamers, wipe those starry eyes and ditch the rose-tinted goggles. You think being a knight-errant, a wandering hero, right, was all about slaying dragons, rescuing damsels, and basking in eternal glory. I emphasizes, leans into the camera, think again. Because today, we're not just pulling back the curtain, we're ripping it down, setting it on fire, and dancing on the ashes to reveal the cold, hard, often hilarious, and undeniably sucky truth about these so-called champions of yore. For centuries, poets and storytellers have spun tales of their valor, their freedom, their noble quests. But what those pretty poems didn't tell you was about the crippling debt, the constant threat of dysentery, the soul-crushing loneliness, and the high probability of ending up as bandit chow, or worse, becoming the bandit. Therefore, if you're ready to trade the fairy tale for the freakin' horror show, stick around. I'm host's name, and I'm about to take you on a whirlwind tour of why it monumentally, catastrophically, and often comically sucked to be a knight-errant. By the end of this, you'll wonder why anyone willingly signed up for this medieval misery package. So, we've just waded through a historical mud pit packed with some harsh truths about those wandering knights. If you, for some wonderfully twisted reason, still enjoyed digging through this historical misery with me, or if you actually learned something that'll make you think twice before naming your firstborn Lancelot, then please do me a solid, hit that like button for this video. And hey, don't just stop there. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss out on any more historical reality checks. We're going to dive even deeper into the price they paid for that shiny but ultimately empty armor, or how an arrow could so easily slide into becoming a cold-blooded mercenary just because, well, they were desperately hungry. Not to mention the secrets of medieval inns that, after hearing them, will definitely make you want to hug your modern toilet. Oh, and by the way, where are you all watching this from? The US, Australia, or maybe you're hiding out in some castle somewhere. What time is it where you are? Is it a beautiful morning or the dead of night? Let me know right down in the comments below, and most importantly, please watch this video to the end, because the laugh out loud details about a knight's diet or the survival tips for dealing with bandits and fleas are guaranteed to make you crack up. Don't miss the moment a noble knight has to battle a sudden, urgent case of tummy troubles right in the middle of an imaginary fight. Trust me, it's even more epic than a Hollywood movie. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll catch you in the next one. So, you've decided the 9 to 5 feudal grind isn't for you. You're gonna be a knight-errant, a free spirit, a wandering warrior of renown. Sounds romantic, right? Well, let's just peel back that shiny veneer of heroism and see what's really festering underneath, because the first thing you'll discover is that being a knight-errant means you are, to put it mildly, spectacularly, and perpetually broke. Now, you think being a knight just requires a brave heart and a dull sword. Big mistake. For the world to look at you and exclaim, "Oh my, what a fine hero," first you have to look like a fine hero. And that look, it devours money like a gambling addict. First, let's talk about the armor. Oh, that shining armor you always see in movies. To get that shining look, you either needed a squire as diligent as a busy bee, toiling day and night polishing it with sand and vinegar, or your armor would soon turn into a pile of rust, looking like a garden hoe forgotten in the rain. And its price? Good heavens. A decent full suit of plate armor, the kind that could help you survive a few heavy blows, not the flimsy stuff just for show, could cost more than a small farm, complete with livestock and a few peasant families toiling away. In terms of a common soldier's wages back then, you'd probably have to starve yourself for several years. Every single piece, from the helmet covering your head, the iron gauntlets, the leg greaves, to the breastplate, was a masterpiece of smithing, painstakingly hammered out, riveted, and meticulously assembled. And if something went wrong, say, some fellow's mace visited your chest a bit too enthusiastically, replacing it wasn't a matter of popping down to the market for a new one. You'd have to trudge off to find another armorer, grit your teeth, and wait for weeks, then dip into your already empty purse for another hefty sum. And whether there was anything left in that purse was the real question. Then there's the padding underneath. You couldn't just wear that cold, hard iron directly against your skin, unless you wanted your flesh chafed raw and to feel every icy blast to your bones. You needed a padded garment, a gambeson or akiton, to absorb shock and prevent the metal from rubbing. That wasn't free either. Even a simple mail hauberk, made of thousands of tiny interlinked iron rings, was a huge investment in time and money. And what's the mortal enemy of iron and steel? Rust. Just one dewy night sleeping rough under the stars, and your several hundred ducat breastplate could start turning a lovely shade of mud brown, looking as pathetic as a discarded farming tool. Next up, weapons. A good sword, well balanced and made of decent steel, wasn't something you could pick up at a market stall next to the turnips. It was a specialist item, a symbol of your status, and of course, its price was special too. And swords broke, chipped, and dulled, just like anything else. Lances, basically disposable. You might carry a few, but after one or two shatters against an opponent's shieldas, or, more embarrassingly, against a tree you misjudged during a charge, you were looking for replacements. Daggers, maces, axes each added to the ever-lengthening bill. And you had to know how to use all of them, which implied years of training that also cost money, or was part of a long, often thankless, apprenticeship as a lowly squire. But the real money pit, the four-legged financial grinder, was your warhorse. Not just any old nag would do. You needed a destrier, a charger bred for strength, stamina, and courage, not some docile pony for leisurely village strolls. These animals were the medieval equivalent of a sports car combined with a tank, and their price tags matched. Buying one could put you in debt for years. And feeding it, a warhorse devoured vast quantities of oats and hay, premium fuel for a premium machine. You couldn't just let it graze by the roadside like a peasant's donkey. It needed proper fodder, and lots of it, every single day, whether you were earning a copper or not. Then there were the horseshoes. Farriers weren't working for free, and if your horse went lame, got sick, or, God forbid, was injured in a skirmish or a tournament fall, veterinary care back then was rudimentary at best, often consisting of poultices made from dung and wishful thinking. More likely, you were looking at a long, slow recovery for your steed, sledge during which neither of you were earning, or a heartbreaking but unavoidable and incredibly expensive decision: get a new horse. And don't forget the tack, the saddle, the bridle, the barding if you really wanted to show off cess and had somehow stumbled into a fortune. All of it cost money. All of it wore out. All of it needed maintenance. Your horse wasn't so much a noble companion as a four-legged financial vortex, constantly sucking your meager resources into its perpetually hungry maw. So, with these monumental expenses, how on earth was a knight-errant supposed to make ends meet? The romantic tales speak of rewards for brave deeds, of generous kings showering them with gold and jewels. The reality was somewhat less glittering. Your primary hope for income often lay in tournaments. But tournaments were a massive gamble. First, there was the entry fee, because the organizers weren't running a charity. Then you had to travel to the tournament venue, often hundreds of miles, feeding yourself and your horse along the way. Your armor had to be in top-notch condition, because looking shabby was a great way to be underestimated, or worse, ridiculed. And then, the competition itself. You weren't just justing against other down-on-their-luck wanderers. You were up against wealthy barons with stables full of fresh warhorses and coffers overflowing with gold, knights from great households with retinues, and the best equipment money could buy. The chances of a lone, financially struggling knight-errant consistently winning against such odds were slim. And if you lost, well, not only did you not get the prize money, but you might also lose your horse and armor to your victorious opponent as part of the tournament's ransom rules. One bad day at the lists could see you reduced from a knight to a pedestrian, stripped of the very symbols and tools of your profession. Even the troubadour Bertrand de Born lamented in the 12th century that the rich nobles were already making it hard for poorer knights to earn a decent living from tournaments, often by colluding or simply out spending them. What about ransoms from battle? Another lovely idea if you happen to be on the winning side, and if you personally managed to capture someone important, and if that important someone actually had the means and inclination to pay up. More often, any significant captives were claimed by the great lords leading the army. A common soldier or a minor knight you captured might yield a pittance, barely enough to cover the cost of replacing your broken lance. And warfare itself was a dangerous, unpredictable business. For every knight who made a fortune from a lucky capture, there were dozens who ended up dead, maimed, or captured themselves, facing their own ruinous ransom demands. Then there was the prospect of patronage from a wealthy noble. This was essentially glorified begging, but with more bowing and my lord-ing. You'd hang around a great lord's court, hoping to catch his eye with your martial prowess or your charming if increasingly desperate flattery, praying he'd deign to take you into his household as a household knight. This meant a roof over your head, regular meals of a sort, and perhaps even a small stipend or gifts of equipment. But it also meant a loss of your vaunted freedom. You were now his man, subject to his whims, expected to fight his petty squabbles, guard his person, and generally make yourself useful. Your errantry was over. You were now, effectively, a highly skilled, heavily armed bodyguard and enforcer. And these positions weren't always easy to come by, especially when there was a surplus of landless knights all vying for the same limited spots. You might spend months, even years, drifting from one castle to another, offering your sword only to be met with polite refusals or vague promises. The errant part of your title often just meant chronically unemployed and increasingly anxious. So, when the glamorous avenues of income proved to be more like treacherous mudslides, where did that leave you? Often, it left you with a profound appreciation for the immediate, the tangible, the stuff that kept body and soul and horse together. Forget noble quests for justice. Your most pressing quest was often for dinner. The romantic image of the knight feasting in a great hall, quaffing wine from a jeweled goblet, was pure fantasy for most wanderers. Your reality was more likely to be a hunk of stale bread. If you were lucky, perhaps some cheese of questionable origin, and water that you hoped hadn't been too recently downstream from a tannery or a particularly well-used latrine. You might carry some dried meat or hardtack, but supplies ran out. Foraging was an option if you knew your edible berries from your these will make you see your ancestors' fungi, and if the local peasants hadn't already stripped the countryside bare. Begging from those same peasants was a grim irony, given you were supposedly their protector. But sometimes pride had to be swallowed along with the watery gruel they might offer out of pity or fear. Meat was a luxury. Even at an inn, if you could afford one, you'd be lucky to get a bowl of pottage, a thick vegetable stew, perhaps with a few scraps of mystery meat floating in it. Horse bread, made from beans and peas, was a common, cheap staple, and yes, sometimes desperate humans ate it too. This constant, knowing hunger, this uncertainty about your next meal, was a far cry from the heroic banquets of legend. It was just another layer of suck. This persistent financial destitution, this daily tightrope walk over the abyss of utter poverty, didn't just make you look like a heavily armed beggar. It was a slow-acting poison that gradually killed off that so-called noble chivalric spirit you cherished. Oh, the code of chivalry. A beautiful manifesto of lofty virtues: protect the weak, uphold justice, show mercy, defend the church, be courteous to ladies, preserve honor, fight bravely. Sounds magnificent, doesn't it? A blueprint for a more civilized, better warrior. And perhaps for a wealthy, landed knight with a full belly and a secure position, it was an achievable aspiration, at least some of the time. But for our broke, starving, wandering knight-errant, it was often an impossible standard, a cruel joke played by a world that cared little for ideals when survival was on the line. Let's take protect the weak, a noble sentiment. But what happens when the weak are the peasants whose meager stores of grain are the only thing standing between you and starvation? What happens when protecting some downtrodden serf means incurring the wrath of a powerful local lord, the very same lord you might have been hoping to impress for a position in his retinue? Suddenly, looking the other way starts to seem like a very pragmatic form of self-preservation. How about uphold justice? Wonderful, but if justice in a particular region is dispensed by a corrupt and brutal magistrate, and intervening means you end up in his dungeon, forgotten and left to rot? Or what if the only employment you can find is serving as an enforcer for a baron whose idea of justice involves terrorizing his own tenants into submission? Your sword, supposedly a tool of righteousness, becomes an instrument of oppression. all for a few desperately needed coins and a place by the fire. Show mercy, the code commands. A truly Christian virtue. But in the brutal calculus of medieval combat, mercy could be a fatal mistake. You unhorse an opponent in a skirmish, he yields. Do you accept his surrender, tend his wounds, and hope for a ransom you'll probably never see? Or do you finish him off, eliminating a potential future threat, and perhaps looting his corpse for anything valuable? When you're alone, outnumbered, and miles from any friendly face, the pragmatic, if brutal, option often won out over the chivalrous one. The battlefield wasn't a stage for noble gestures, it was a charnel house where survival often trumped sanctity. Preserve honor. This was the bedrock of knighthood. Your word was your bond. Your reputation was everything. But what is honor when your stomach is eating itself? What is reputation when you're sleeping in a ditch, lice crawling through your hair? Does honor prevent you from subtly pilfering an apple from an unguarded market stall? Does it stop you from exaggerating your past deeds to impress a potential patron? Does it keep you from quietly slinking away from a fight you know you can't win, even if the ballads would demand a glorious, if suicidal, last stand? The constant, grinding pressure of poverty and vulnerability wore away at honor like water on stone, leaving behind a residue of shame and cynicism. Don Quixote, centuries later, would become the ultimate tragicomic symbol of a man desperately clinging to these outdated ideals in a world that had long since decided they were impractical, even laughable. But for the historical Knight-Errant, this wasn't a literary device, it was a daily, painful internal conflict. This inherent contradiction between the lofty ideals of chivalry and the grim necessities of survival often led knights errant down paths that were distinctly un-chivalrous. When the occasional tournament prize or the rare act of noble patronage failed to materialize, what then? Many found an outlet for their martial skills in the burgeoning mercenary market. Hedge knights, they were sometimes called, selling their swords to anyone who could pay, fighting in petty local wars, sieges, or even acting as hired muscle for merchants' caravans. The pay was often poor, the conditions harsh, and the nobility of the cause usually non-existent. You weren't fighting for God or glory, you were fighting for your next meal, your allegiance as flexible as your purse was empty. And for some, even this was too precarious or not lucrative enough. The slide into becoming part of a free company or a band of roachiers was a common, if lamentable, trajectory for many disillusioned and desperate knights. These weren't organized armies fighting for a king or a recognized cause. They were, essentially, roving bands of heavily armed, highly skilled, and chronically unemployed soldiers, often led by charismatic but ruthless captains, who made their living by terrorizing the countryside. They preyed on villages, extorted protection money from towns, looted monasteries, and generally made life a living hell for the very peasants the knights were theoretically sworn to protect. The lines blurred. Was Sir Reginald, formerly of the king's service, now second, in command of a notorious band of brigands, still a knight, or had he become something else entirely, a monster born of desperation and the failure of the system to provide for him? For many, the descent was gradual, a series of small compromises, until one day they looked in a polished shield and no longer recognized the face or the soul staring back. The ultimate degradation, of course, was to become a common bandit, a highwayman lurking in the woods, using your knightly skills to rob terrified merchants and pilgrims. From a symbol of order to an agent of chaos, all because the chivalric dream had curdled into a nightmare of poverty and disillusionment. Now, let's talk about that freedom of the open road. The image is potent, a lone figure, silhouetted against the sunset, master of his own destiny, a medieval easy rider. The reality, the open road was often just an open invitation to get murdered, robbed, or die of something unpleasant and entirely preventable with modern medicine. Medieval roads, where they even deserved the name, were frequently little more than rutted, muddy tracks. Signage was non-existent. Getting lost was easy, and in a sparsely populated landscape, getting lost could be a death sentence, especially in bad weather. And the company you kept on these roads, not always the most salubrious. Bandits were a constant menace. Forests, mountain passes, even stretches of seemingly open country could harbor ambush parties. And who made a more tempting target than a knight, presumably carrying valuable weapons, armor, and perhaps even some coin. You might be a skilled warrior, but even the best knight could be overwhelmed by a determined gang of cutthroats, especially if caught unawares. We even have records of knights themselves, like Sir Thomas Malory, the author of Le Morte d'Arthur, engaging in distinctly knightly activities like cattle raiding and extortion, blurring the lines between knight-errant and common thug. And it wasn't just organized gangs. Desperate individuals, starving peasants, or even other broke knights might see you as an opportunity. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be your last. Then there was the joy of navigating different political territories. Europe wasn't a neat patchwork of friendly nations. It was a chaotic tapestry of feudal lordships, each with its own rules, its own tolls, its own suspicions of outsiders. Wandering into a new baron's lands without a letter of introduction or a clear, non-threatening purpose could see you clapped in irons as a spy, a poacher, or simply an undesirable vagrant. Papers, please, wasn't just a 20th century concern. A medieval lord wanted to know who you were and what you were doing on his turf. And if he didn't like your answers, your errantry could come to a very abrupt and unpleasant end in his dungeon. And let's not forget the sheer physical discomfort of it all. Riding for hours, days, weeks on end, in all kinds of weather, takes its toll, even if you weren't wearing your full armor, while travelings and most sensible knights didn't, unless battle was imminent, because it was akin to being cooked alive in a mobile oven. Not to mention the wear and tear on the armor and the horse. You were still exposed to the elements. Rain, snow, biting winds, scorching sun, you endured it all with minimal shelter. That romantic image of sleeping under the stars. It's a lot less romantic when it's pouring rain, you're shivering uncontrollably, and every insect in a 5-mile radius has decided your cloak is the place to be. This constant exposure, coupled with poor nutrition, weakened your constitution and made you far more susceptible to illness. When night fell, or when you simply couldn't ride any further, you sought shelter. If you were lucky and had a few coins, you might find an inn. But medieval inns were rarely the cozy, welcoming havens of fantasy novels. More often, they were filthy, overcrowded, and morally dubious establishments. You might find yourself sharing a single, large, straw-filled bedcellars, if you were lucky enough to get a bed at all, rather than a spot on the floor with half a dozen other travelers snoring, coughing, farting strangers, some of whom might have nimble fingers and an eye for your purse. The straw itself was rarely changed and was often a thriving ecosystem of fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other unmentionable vermin. You'd wake up itching in places you didn't know you had. The innkeeper might be an honest fellow, or he might be in league with the local bandits, ready to tip them off that a seemingly well-equipped knight had just checked in. The food, if you dared to eat it, was usually basic, often stale, and sometimes actively hazardous to your health. Mystery meat stew was a staple, and you tried not to think too hard about what mystery it was. The all was often watered down, or worse, and the hygiene. Let's just say the concept of regular sanitation was still a few centuries off. Latrines, if they existed, were usually just a pit in the backyard, and the stench could be overwhelming. The streets of medieval towns and villages were open sewers, with animal and human waste thrown out of windows or left to fester in gutters. Water sources, wells, rivers, streams were frequently contaminated. This pervasive lack of hygiene was a breeding ground for disease. And disease, in the medieval world, was a constant, terrifying companion. Forget heroic deaths in battle, you were far more likely to be carried off by something mundane and disgusting. Dysentery, the bloody flux, was rampant, caused by contaminated food and water. It was debilitating, dehydrating, and often fatal. Typhus, spread by lice, was another common killer, especially in crowded, unsanitary conditions like those found in many inns or army camps. Then there was the ever-present terror of plague, the Black Death being the most infamous, but outbreaks of various pestilences were a regular feature of medieval life. Leprosy, smallpox, influenza, measles, sweating sickness, the list of potential ailments was long and horrifying. And as a traveler, constantly moving from one potentially infected area to another, sleeping in dubious lodgings, and often with a weakened immune system from poor diet and exposure, you were a prime candidate. Getting sick on the road, far from any friends or family, with no access to proper care, was often a death sentence. What passed for medical treatment was a terrifying lottery of folk remedies, superstitions, and outright quackery. If you fell ill, you might consult a local wise woman who would offer herbal concoctions that might, or might not, do anything other than make you vomit. Or you might seek out a barber, surgeon, whose skills often extended little further than bloodletting, a universal panacea that probably killed more patients than it cured. Pulling teeth elves with pliers, no anesthetic, and lancing boils. Monasteries sometimes had infirmaries and monks with some rudimentary medical knowledge, often based on ancient Greek texts, but their resources were limited, and they weren't always accessible or welcoming to every wandering stranger. A simple infection from a scratch could turn septic and kill you. A broken bone, if not set properly, and it rarely was, could leave you crippled for life. The good old days were, in medical terms, an absolute horror show. Your nightly valor was no defense against a virulent bacterium or a raging fever. If the constant threat of poverty, moral compromise, violence, and disease wasn't enough to dampen your chivalric spirits, there was also the profound psychological toll of this lifestyle. The knight-errant, by definition, was a solitary figure, or at best accompanied by a single squire, if he could even afford one. In a world where community, kinship, and allegiance to a local lord were paramount, you were an outsider, a drifter. This bred a deep sense of isolation. You might meet people on the road, share a meal at an inn, or even fight alongside other knights in a tournament or a skirmish. But these connections were fleeting. There was no one to confide in, no one to share your fears or your as rare triumphs with, no stable social network to fall back on. Your horse might become your closest companion, but its conversational skills were, shall we say, limited. This loneliness, this lack of belonging, could be as corrosive to the soul as rust was to armor. Furthermore, you were often viewed with suspicion. Peasants, wary of any armed stranger, might see you as a potential threat, a freebooter come to steal their meager possessions or demand food and shelter with menaces. They'd seen enough of noble knights behaving badly to be cynical. Landed gentry, secure in their castles and their social positions, might look down on you as a landless, masterless man, a DA Class A warrior, perhaps even a vagrant or a potential troublemaker. You lacked the clear social standing that came with holding fiefs or serving a recognized liege. You were an unknown quantity, and in the rigidly hierarchical society of the Middle Ages, the unknown was often feared or despised. And then there was the slow, creeping realization that the world was changing and not in your favor. The very skills that defined you as a knight, mastery of the horse and lance, proficiency with the sword and shield, the ability to fight effectively in heavy armor, were gradually becoming less decisive on the battlefield. The rise of disciplined infantry formations, armed with long pikes that could unhorse even the most skilled charger, began to challenge the dominance of heavy cavalry. The English longbow, with its incredible range and penetrative power, could wreak havoc on armored knights from a distance, as famously demonstrated at Crecy and Agincourt. And then, the most game-changing innovation of all, gunpowder. Early cannons and handguns were crude and unreliable, but they signaled the beginning of the end for the age of the armored knight. Your expensive, laboriously crafted plate armor, once your greatest protection, was becoming increasingly vulnerable to a well-aimed lead ball. Kings and princes, too, were changing the way they waged war. They began to rely more on standing armies, professional soldiers paid a regular wage, loyal directly to the crown or state, rather than feudal levies of knights whose service was often limited and whose loyalties could be complicated. Mercenary companies, while often employing knights, were a sign of this shift towards a more professionalized, less chivalric form of warfare. The knight-errant, the individualistic hero relying on his personal prowess, was becoming an anachronism. Your particular brand of freelance daring was less in demand. There were fewer glorious quests, fewer dragons to slay if there ever truly were, fewer damsels in genuine need of your specific brand of rescue. The world was moving on, and it had less and less space for a wandering warrior clinging to an outdated code and an increasingly irrelevant skill set. This sense of becoming obsolete, of your life's work and training losing its meaning, must have been a bitter pill to swallow, adding an existential dread to the already long list of miseries. you weren't just broke, sick, and lonely. You were also becoming a dinosaur, gazing bewilderedly at the approaching comet of modernity. And that, my friends, is a truly profound and multifaceted kind of suck. So, there you have it, the grand, glittering, glorious life of a knight-errant. Sounds absolutely enchanting, doesn't it? Like a non-stop medieval theme park ride, if that theme park was designed by a sadist with a penchant for dysentery and financial ruin. Let's just quickly recap the highlight reel of suckage, shall we? We've got the soul, crushing, back, breaking debt that made your shiny armor feel less like protection and more like a very expensive, very heavy ball and chain. We've got the constant, desperate scramble for your next meal, which often involved morally questionable choices that would make your sainted grandmother weep. We've got the open road, which was less a path to adventure and more a gauntlet of bandits, bad weather, and even worse inns, those charming little hovels where the fleas had more rights than the guests, and the stew probably contained last week's roadkill. Then there's the delightful smorgasbord of medieval diseases, any one of which could turn your insides into a bubbling cauldron of regret, far from any competent medical help. Because competent medical help in those days usually involved leeches and praying you didn't die from the cure. Add to that the profound, gnawing loneliness of being a perpetual outsider, viewed with suspicion by peasants and disdained by nobles, your only true companion a horse that probably resented you for the poor quality of its oats. And let's not forget the psychological torment of trying to live up to a ludicrously impractical code of chivalry, while simultaneously trying not to starve or get shanked for your boots, leading to a spectacular case of medieval imposter syndrome. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, the cherry on top of this misery Sunday the slow, dawning, agonizing realization that you, Sir Knight-Errant, were becoming utterly, hopelessly obsolete. The world was changing. Warfare was evolving. Gunpowder was making your fancy armor about as useful as a chocolate teapot in a cannon fight. Society was moving on, and your particular brand of freelance, pointy, stick-waving heroism was going out of style faster than last year's wimple. You weren't just struggling, you were becoming irrelevant. A historical footnote. A medieval dinosaur blinking in the harsh light of a new era. So, that freedom the poets sang about. It was the grim freedom of the dispossessed, the desperate liberty of having nothing left to lose except maybe your lice-infested undershirt. Their noble quests. More often than not, they were just a frantic, day-to-day hunt for basic survival, a scrap of food, a dry place to sleep, a fleeting moment where the overwhelming suckiness of it all didn't entirely crush your spirit. The romantic legend of the knight-errant is one of history's most successful whitewashed jobs. A beautiful tapestry woven to hide the stains of poverty, violence, disease, and despair. Therefore, the next time you see a gallant knight in shining armor charging across your movie screen, take a moment. Picture him not as a hero, but as a profoundly unlucky sod who was probably riddled with fleas, deeply in debt, stank to high heaven, was one bad sausage away from an utterly unheroic and agonizing end, and was quite possibly wondering if he could pawn his sword for a decent drink. Being a knight-errant, yeah, it didn't just suck. It royally, comprehensively, and in almost every conceivable way, sucked.
Mm-hmm.